Okay, so thank you very much. And I have a paper on my desk at the moment which has 4 reviewers' comments, all of them contradictory. And it's from Alex's journal. But we're slowly addressing that. So yes, I'm really pleased to talk about this topic because it's quite a fun topic and it's been a lot of fun to prepare this. When I'm usually asked to give talks, it's usually about public health issues, about drug deaths, about infectious diseases or young people and trauma. So this was really good fun for me. And originally I was asked, oh, Harry, do you want to give a talk about Twitter? So I thought, why am I being asked to do that? But I thought, yeah, that's good. But then thinking about it, I expanded it out. And what I really want to do is to highlight what I think are some really nice alternative methods for knowledge exchange. Just a few that I've picked up. Of course, there's many, many more, and I'm really keen to hear about more of these. But I think they're a nice way to think about impact and engagement in different ways. We had a really nice workshop this morning about democratizing participation in drugs research. And one of the ways that we can do this is forget about peer-reviewed journal articles and actually work with communities and develop new ways of involving people in research and disseminating research. So I don't have any relevant declarations of interest. Just a quick advert that ACMD is going to be publishing 2 reports in the next few months, one around risk and resilience on Friday, and then there'll be a big report in the new year on homelessness. And I know a few colleagues in the room contributed to that, but that's the sales pitch over. Look out for those. Okay, so in terms of public engagement, I don't really have a lot to say about this. Most of us have a general awareness and understanding of public engagement. But just to reflect on my initial comments, that there's no reason why, as academics, we shouldn't be thinking about the impact of our work beyond the REF, beyond impact factors. Yes, they're really important, but what difference does that actually make? And I know our Pro VCs for research, for example, and our REF coordinators, for those of us in research institutes and universities, are asking us to focus on this. But essentially, what difference does most of the research that we do make? And I would actually argue that a lot of the research that we do could actually be quite pointless. So if we think about public engagement and knowledge exchange, I think it allows us as academics to expand our thoughts and also our definition about what our professional roles are. And are we actually making a difference? And what ways are we making a difference? And there's been lots of interesting work on public engagement, which I won't repeat because this has been a theme which I think is throughout this conference. There's also been a lot of work around more traditional knowledge exchange processes. And I recommend you, if you are interested in the use of knowledge in general, which includes alternative dissemination techniques in changing practice and policy, then the work of Bywood and colleagues from Australia, where they've developed evidence-based guidelines around this, is really useful. And I did a piece of work for the EMCDDA last year, which also looked at this. But some of the things which I think are very relevant to my discussion today are, in order to affect change in policy and practice, yes, we must consider all the things that Alex mentioned earlier on today. Yes, we must consider normalization of practice and implementation, but we should also think about how people learn and engage in knowledge. And one of the key things from this body of evidence is around interacting with people, different formats, focusing on persuasion, understanding the context people are working in, and developing materials which they can use in those contexts. So lots of research on this, which you can draw upon. And I think there's a lot to learn from research into media-based interventions. So in public health and the drugs field, when we think of mass media interventions, we often think of ineffective approaches that, the Montana Meth Project, Faces of Meth, or Faces of Addiction, or the Talk to Frank website, those sorts of approaches. But media research tells us probably the beneficial effects we can have through using mass media and different forms of media are probably indirect. And we could probably have a really interesting discussion, for example, about the successes of minimum unit pricing in Scotland, and how part of that, part of those policy successes, was some of the indirect effects of some of the discussions, etc., which were taking place in mass media. And I also was reminded when Alex was talking about the case of medical cannabis in the UK at the moment, and contrasting that sort of approach and that way, different way of framing a policy and drugs issue, contrasting that with some of the debates that we've been having around drug consumption rooms. Now, obviously, there's very big differences there, and then the paper that I referred to is looking at this, a paper with Kirsten and Andy at the back there, that the way that these sorts of issues are presented in the media was very, very different. Now, of course, there's issues about the affected target groups. There's also issues about, the political capital that have been gained. But some of the strategies which have been used for those two very important policy issues have been very different. And admittedly, some policy issues are more aligned to perhaps more creative engagement techniques. I certainly wouldn't want to trivialize drug-related deaths and HIV, for example. But I suppose we can, I think, learn from some of these successful campaigns and the way that they've used alternative forms of engagement. And if we bring this to thinking about the impact that we make and how we should develop impact and how we can make a difference. So I advise you to go, a bit difficult to read, but it's at the bottom there, there's the public engagement, National Public Engagement Collaborative. They have a really nice website with lots of advice on this around developing and evidencing pathways to impact. And I'll return to evidencing impact right at the end, because this is obviously key. But for the purposes of this talk, they provide some really useful advice about understanding target audiences, modifying your dissemination techniques depending upon those target audiences, and embedding those techniques as part of a longer term strategy. And I'll return to this in a moment. And I'm a big fan of the work of Paul Kearney and Catherine Oliver, and they very readable papers attempt to summarize how, as academics and researchers, we can engage and influence policy with policymakers. Often I think it's probably down to luck and contacts that you have and networking. But there are different ways and lessons that we can draw upon about producing outputs that are accessible, that are flexible, thinking about how you can use research outputs to advocate for an issue, or whether you want to take a more traditional academic route as being an evidence broker. But I think more importantly is a process of continual engagement with policymakers and understanding the realities and working lives of policymakers as well, and who they have to engage with and their stakeholders. And I think some of the alternative methods that I'll talk about in a moment really tap into that. And from my experience, particularly as senior policymakers are very, very receptive to some of these alternative techniques. Half expecting boos from academic colleagues when I mentioned REF 2021, but I'm a REF coordinator for our university, so this is forefront of my mind. So as part of the guidance for REF 2021, and we have to, as you know, we have to develop impact case studies. And really importantly, REF 2021 have highlighted that public engagement activities can form the basis of an impact case study. You don't simply need a patent or a change in policy. Changing the way the public thinks about an issue or engages with an issue will make a very good case study. And I'll refer back to an example a bit later. So what is public engagement with respect to REF? So this is just for the university academics here. Lots of guidance on this, and I imagine that most of you in universities will be starting this process and going to endless workshops and sandbox activities at the moment. But a key message for me, and I'll return to at the end, is that simply engaging with the public doesn't count as impact. We have to be able to understand and evidence how community members and people interact with the research and activities that you're doing, and how they take it up, react, and respond to it. Now, this is a really tricky thing to be able to evaluate in evidence. And when I was collecting together some of my case studies for this presentation, it was a question that I asked all the developers of these particular techniques, and all of them had struggled with it. And I think that's a common finding. So why do we need to do this? I've outlined some general reasons. This was a really nice article from Slate magazine back in the summer, and it was essentially arguing that most academic texts are written not to be read. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And it was arguing that a lot of academic texts, particularly from particular disciplines, are designed to be broken down in other publications, which make it easy to synthesize. So I think we need to think about alternative mechanisms, because the traditional ones that we're using don't seem to be cutting through. And if we look at some of the citation rates of some of the leading journals in the field, so even, Addiction, which is considered, the biggest and most impactful journal in our field, the average paper over a period of about 4 or 5 years will get about 8 citations. It's not reaching a big audience, and it's not really reaching an audience that counts. And just to reflect on my own work, I just picked a couple of examples. So the top one is a paper I published a few years ago looking at forensic analysis of new psychoactive substances. I would consider this as a success, large number of citations, mentioned in a few policy documents, and that's great, big tick, gold star in terms of my professorial review every year. But so what? It didn't make a huge amount of difference. The reality is that for most of us, our papers are probably like the second one that I mentioned. This is a paper that I did with a colleague at the University of Liverpool looking at the interaction between alcohol and cocaine use. I thought it was a really nice paper, a really nice study. We had some good conclusions in it. One single citation, and that was actually an ACMD report on cocaine. And coincidentally, I sit on that committee. But, I think just from a personal perspective, it's that some of the indicators of success that we have and are measured against, certainly in universities, don't have much bearing upon the real world, and in particular, engagement of public and discussions around drugs. This is just one last example before I move on to some practical case studies. So this is a commentary piece that I published with Dr. Susie Gage on addiction a few weeks ago. So Rat Park, how a rat paradise changed the narrative of addiction. So this was just a commentary on the classic Bruce Alexander paper. You can read it. I think it's accessible at the moment. But the key thing about this is that this was tweeted out by Susie and myself, and already after a couple of weeks, we've already reached 92,000 readers on Twitter, and Altmetric, which is one indicator of engagement, suggests that this particular paper is in the top 5 research outputs of all time, which is bizarre for a paper which was only published a couple of weeks ago on a topic that lots of people can engage with. But the key thing for us is that 60% of the tweeters were members of the general public. It wasn't academics sharing and talking about this particular piece amongst themselves. And it's had no citations. So I mentioned Twitter, and I was asked to talk about my tweeting activity. I think that's an adverb. But I approach Twitter and social media in a very targeted way. So this is just my account, and I clearly separate my social media work, and whether that's through communication of research findings, engagement and debates and topics, from any of my personal accounts. And for me, this is really important. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, and I won't be talking about these things whatsoever. But for me personally, going on Twitter is a useful way of reaching wide, diverse audiences. So, for example, on Sunday, when I was just finalising my slides, there was an article in the BBC about, I think it was data from Scotland actually, about addicted babies, completely irrelevant term. So I did a tweet about that. in a few hours, lots and lots of retweets, but more importantly, lots of engagement and discussions with people not involved in the drugs field. So we had a nice conversation with one other user on Twitter, for example, talking about why I had this view that we shouldn't be using terms of addiction. Really interesting to share their views on this. So I think Twitter's a really, really good way of getting involved, particularly with the public, but also with people from outside your field as well. Now, I'm not going to give you a masterclass on Twitter, because I'm sure your organizations would do this already in training. But just to say that I think this is one good way of reaching outside of your bubble and engaging with diverse audiences. And just from a very personal perspective, as a result of particular tweets, I actually got invited to this conference to talk, so thank you very much. A tweet I did about fentanyl, I ended up on the BBC News that very evening, so there's me looking awkward in my living room, not expecting to be on TV. And I did some tweets around some narratives which were taking place around middle-class use of cocaine. And by the end of the week, I was asked to write this article for BBC News, which within 1 week had 1 million views, according to the BBC. Now, I could have written an editorial about this, or I could have written a departmental blog about this, and I suspect I would have got 10 readers. So there is lots of advice, just mindful of time. There's good advice out there, but I think for me, the key message, and this particularly relates to Betsy's talk about publication. So, if there's any advice, I see lots of tweets from academics saying, yay, new paper published, go to the Journal of Advanced Studies, new paper on such and such is published. Well, great, fantastic. If you're interested in that field, that's brilliant. I suspect many people won't be. This is really good advice from one Twitter user I saw. Give a headline, link to a blog if possible, do a thread talking about taking people through the findings of your paper, make links to other news articles and other resources, and engage and start a discussion. And this is the sort of advice that your media teams or public relations will talk about, that good Twitter accounts share interesting content, post your own interesting content, but key, engage with other users. And this takes time, and this is sometimes difficult. Never engage in a Twitter slanging match is my advice. But there are other forms of social media. So thanks to one of our PhD students, Jane Harris, for talking me through this. And one of the key things that Jane talks about through her PhD is that when people think about social media strategies, for example, what they're actually doing is building elaborate empty rooms. And I think this is often relevant to social media strategies attached to some of our projects. We have big ideas, we design and we develop something, but perhaps we're unaware or we have unrealistic expectations about the level of engagement that you have to take part in to maintain interest in that particular strategy. Who's heard of Zoella, the YouTuber Zoella? 12 million subscribers. And the reasons why Zoella is hugely successful is because she engages her viewers with that personal relationship. It's a two-way process. Now, she has her own motivations, etc. But I think some of the lessons that we've learned from YouTubers can be very relevant. Being relatable, being as somebody who's a trusted and credible form of information, for example. Other ways to do this, some of the things I like. So some of you may have heard of Dr. Susie Gage's podcast, Say Why to Drugs, a hugely popular podcast. Millions of downloads, Susie's won an award. But critically, it's about an academic engaging on a regular basis and interacting with the public. And Susie, when she talks about her podcast, talks about how useful it's been that to go outside of her comfort zone. So, it would be fine for her to talk to liberal newspapers, The Guardian, or even, The Times, for example. But it enables her to interact with audiences, perhaps who she wouldn't ordinarily do with. Daily Mail readers, for example. Academics often moan and complain about the Daily Mail, but if we don't engage with that demographic, then how are we able to talk about these important issues? Other things, recent things. So in London at the moment, King's College have developed the Hooked art show, which has received some great national reviews in national newspapers. 4-star review in The Guardian. Whether that becomes a 4-star case study, I don't know. But this is about researchers working with artists to describe and engage audiences about a particular issue in completely different ways. So some of the artworks, really, really thought-provoking, are not direct translations of work, but help to frame and conceptualize an addiction in very different ways. Something, a work I've been following, and I'm sure many of you will be aware of this, is some of the Distant Voices project. So this is a musical project ostensibly led by Professor Fergus McNeill, but many other people involved as well. And this is about looking at the really tough and tricky issues that people face when they come out of prison or complete a community sentence. So this is a really interesting collaboration between academics, people affected by this issue, and arts organisation to develop gigs, albums and songs. And Fergus, in his writing, talks about how the actual process of engagement with all these different groups creates the impact. They begin to talk about these different issues, reframe the issues in different ways. Some of my colleagues at John Moores have developed a similar sort of research area. They've developed a game called Probationary, which is based on the game of life. But rather than ending up a millionaire's mansion with a swimming pool, you end up being recalled to prison instead. This was co-developed with men on license and artists, with the involvement of researchers, trying to explore the lived experience of being on probation. And I don't know who it was, but somebody famously quoted that you can understand somebody by playing a game with them for an hour. You understand more playing with them for an hour than you would do in a lifetime. And this has been very successful. So they've had lots of public engagement events. There was part of a Tate modern outreach activity, part of the London Design Festival, as well as doing traditional academic outputs. I don't have time to show a video, but they talk about how as researchers, they really valued this experience as it allowed them to really, they thought, engage with the public on difficult issues. Infographics, so the Human Enhancement Drugs Project has translated some quite technical issues and findings around image and performance enhancing drugs to really stylish infographics. Some work that my colleague Amanda Atkinson has done, where she's particularly interested in representations of femininity and feminism and how that relates to alcohol marketing. So this was research funded by Alcohol Research UK. So in addition to traditional research outputs, Amanda's a practicing artist and she's held a number of exhibitions. Another piece of Amanda's work, which she's looking at the moment at period poverty and the fact, for example, that people who are homeless can't afford sanitary projects. So this is £306, the average annual cost of sanitary products in spare change. Really brings it home, and she's had some really nice exhibitions in Liverpool around that. This is my favourite, the Big D or the Big Dick Nuts, again commenting on double standards. Just aware of time, so I just want to quickly finish off with one more case study, and this is done by Dr. Neve Fitzgerald and Professor Carol Emsley from Glasgow Caledonian, I think. And again, this is a product of some of alcohol work that they've done, funded work. But this is a project to directly engage with policymakers. So in addition to some quite complex infographics, they've done some more targeted activities. And Carol's talked about some of the impact they've had or some of the difficulties in evaluating that impact. And I've been very pleased to see this developed further into campaigning as well. So you might see See some of Glasgow Caledonians don't pink my drink hashtag, which this is looking about the double standards in alcohol marketing. The fact that a lot of alcohol marketing is focused towards women using the language of feminism and empowering women, but being delivered in an environment which still has sexist and double standards towards women's drinking and celebration and nightlife. I think this is a fascinating campaign and is engaging people outside the academy. Very quickly, how do we evaluate our impact? And this is something that all of the case studies, the people I spoke to, did really struggle with. And I think as academics, certainly for REF, we need to evaluate impact. But, back to my initial points about making a difference. But there are frameworks out there. So Reed et al. In 2018 developed a really nice framework for understanding and evaluating and researching public engagement and impact, and identified 5 key areas of impact. So there might be instrumental impacts, capacity building impacts, changing attitudes, which I think is hugely important for some of the populations that we work with. But quite importantly, for maintaining those relationships, impact is important for establishing enduring connectivity. And again, in the workshop this morning, it's one of the things that we spoke about was how do we feedback and report back research findings to the groups that we've been working with. I think that some of these creative techniques are a really good way of doing that don't rely on peer-reviewed academic journals. So that's me, whistle-stop tour of some of the things that have caught my eye, and thank you very much.
Hi, it's kind of a comment, but also a question, and maybe we can talk about it later. I've been at Annalos University of Edinburgh, and I've been engaged with doing quite a lot of public engagement using my accordion and singing songs about my own drug use and other people's drug use. And one of the things, you come away from that and everyone's really talking about it, and you've got all grannies and you've got all different kinds of people, but I have no idea how to start recording, because I think it's potentially attitudinal impact. But I really don't know, and in a sense I don't want to, because I'm not there as a researcher kind of recording things. I'm there to have a conversation with the public, but for this Ref 21, and if I want a career in academia, I've got to somehow start recording the shifts, and I don't really know how to do that.
As part of my slides, which will be distributed, you'll notice some of the web links are to national organisations that help around understanding and evaluating public impact. And I think one of the things that I didn't really have time to talk about, which I think is important, is around professional and researcher identity. That quite often there's a fine line between a research identity and an advocacy identity. And I think sometimes it's important for us to reflect on where we are actually situated on that continuum. Many researchers, are happy to advocate for an issue and campaign for an issue, but that means that fundamentally as a researcher, you have a very different professional identity. So I think that's something that we need to think about. And just a final reflection on that about attitudinal change. And I certainly, because I'm trying to develop some work at the moment, trying to look at this in a bit more detail. And we know that from, for example, research with people with serious mental health or issues, or even with people receiving drug treatment for chaotic drug use, that one of the best ways to reduce stigmatization in all of its manifestation is to reduce social distance between different segments of society and those affected groups. And there's really interesting research, for example, is when you describe affected groups in terms of, I can't remember the phrase, but not what's wrong with them, but what has happened to them. I know there's a nice phrase which summarizes this. And to talk about those experiences, empirical research shows that you can reduce that social distance, and there's actually more positive and supportive attitudes towards those groups. So yeah, all credit to you for taking your accordion out, and nice one.